I'm speaking today about nature and cultural recovery. Next slide, please. Maybe you know what this is. The risk of an event like today is that we're preaching to the converted. Nature is essential. You know that. Art is essential. Perhaps you know that too. And everybody nods. We know from the earliest traces of human life that after staying alive, art can be found. This is the Cueva de los Manos, the Spanish cave for the hands, or the Cave of Hands. It's a cave and a complex set of rocks and art sites in the province of Santa Cruz, Argentina, about 160 kilometers away from the town of Perito Moreno. It's named for the hundreds of hand paintings stenciled into multiple collages on the rocks, and it's thousands and thousands of years old. I love this piece because it's so human and so natural. You put your hand against the wall, you breathe paint and pigment onto it, and you make a record that I was here. Next slide, please. So, from the very earliest points of human life, we saw that humans interacted with the natural world, often as hunters, but also as gatherers, and they told those stories through art. Next slide, please. Artists have an important part to play in the world of nature. Artists have an important part to play in the space of nature recovery. And as you all know, we're not just talking about recovery, stasis, we're talking genuinely about recovery. And I'm going to speak to that in a moment. So just to give you some context as to who I am and where I'm at, other than the lovely biog that was just read out, my main role now is as Director of MIMA and Dean of the MIMA School of Art and Design. MIMA is the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. We have stunning art collections from the 1870s, ceramics, craft, painting, made materials, jewellery. And we run a contemporary art programme. You can see behind me, I've got an image of our current exhibition, which is by Sonia Boyce in the Castle of My Skin. And Sonia is a world-leading artist. She's representing Britain at the Venice Biennale, but her exhibition is a generous project where she's invited 12 contemporary artists living and working today, including 2 artists from the Tees Valley and 2 artists from the MIMA School of Art and Design, to work with her to create an installation. So that really captures the spirit of what we try and do. There's a train going by, so my apologies if that affects my broadcast. So MIMA, what's MIMA got to do with nature then? Let me explain. In 2018, MIMA turned over its whole artistic program to look at climate change and nature. During this time, we built relationships that have become really important to us with visionary leaders in the Tees Valley, people like Rachel from the Tees Valley Local Nature Partnership, and incredible activists, artists, and community members driving change. We met Natural England, the lead agency for advisory agency to the government. We met all sorts of different people at different levels, whether it was community gardeners or policymakers. And those relationships have fueled our thinking for the future. That 1 year was never, ever designed as just a one-off. It was a way of building change into the way that we think and that we do things in relation to one of the greatest crises of our era. So next slide, please. This is an image by Caspar David Friedrich, a painting made at the height of the Romantic era. Here man surveys, and I say man because he is a man, and it's very much a man thing, stands on the brink of the rock and overlooks nature, laid out for him, ready, nature as a lab, nature as an infinite resource. Next slide, please. But we all know that this has changed. and that not only has the reality of what we see in front of us changed, but the way that we think about it has also changed. Next slide, please. During lockdown, over the last few months and over a year now, people's experience of nature has become more extreme. The nation has fallen in love with nature because this bricked up environment is not enough. Next slide, please. From tending houseplants to walking in parks, woodlands, and if you live in the landscape of the Industrial Revolution, old railway lines, we have sought refuge in the green shoots of our surroundings. Whether in cities or in rural areas, finding a place to stand outside, to breathe. And we know how political even the idea of to breathe has become in the last 18 months. To breathe fresh air has become more important than ever. As Sir David Attenborough has said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. Next slide, please. Research also shows that access to nature intersects with inequality. If you're white, able-bodied, middle-class male, you are far more likely to be enriched by natural resources, resources which raise your well-being, your health and your fitness, and your sense of agency. Next slide, please. And you will know, speaking here, we're speaking from a landscape that is associated with dystopia, a landscape which is associated with nature's extraction into the industrial. If we can make change here, we can make change anywhere. Next slide, please. So you might be thinking, but what's this to do with me? What's art got to do with nature, really? And I want to make a provocation to this group that the environmental profession is one of the least diverse professions in the country. You can see here farmers, environmental professionals, and then down to gardeners are some of the whitest and least diverse in the UK. And that produces a risk. And that risk is that the people who care about nature are speaking to other people who care about nature without broadening out that conversation. And so my challenge and the opportunity I present today is that culture has a role to play in opening out a conversation, because these resources are everyone's resources. I'm not doing it in a haranguing way. Culture has its own problems. And in fact, culture is in itself experiencing a time of real crisis post-COVID, and I'll talk about that. But my belief is that by bringing these two worlds together, we can mutually help each other. Next slide, please. So MIMA, as I've said, in its heart is a place where people connect with each other. You can see here the MIMA Zina. MIMA Zina is a magazine that we've been producing during the time that we've been closed as a gallery. It has many stories about nature in it. It's a community magazine, and it's different because it's not just us broadcasting to the world. It's filled with hundreds of pieces of content that have been written by local communities, often about their gardens, about the tree near their house, about things in the world and the environment that inspire them and that they want to share with others. Through MIMA, over the last few months and year, we have been involved in a project that I want to deep dive into very briefly in my few minutes. Next slide, please. And it's called Archipelago. A group of us, environmentalists, scientists, artists, activists, community leaders, gathered to develop a project that outlined a way forward for how could nature recovery and cultural recovery come together. And in a sense, what we developed was a thought experiment. Archipelago, next slide please, produces the idea that as in the nature recovery strategy that we've seen on a national level, our entire island nation is a nation of islands. And that if we see it in this way, culture as an island, environmental communities as an island, communities as islands, and if we see our role as bridge makers and connectors, then actually we have an opportunity both to address some of the issues of nature's recovery, but also connect communities in that and reimagine how nature can be in our world for the future. Next slide, please. And this is just a beginning idea of starting to map where things are happening. And as we went along, we mapped all sorts of opportunities and interconnections that could be made. Next slide, please. And from the macro, what culture offers is the micro. So these are some community members in North Ormsby, in the marketplace, taking plants home from a plant exchange project that we built in the summer of 2019. Next slide, please. And these are some of our community members sitting in our community garden where we grow plants, talking to each other after some of them have worked in the garden, connecting with each other, being inspired both by art, culture, and by nature. Next slide, please. And this is our community plant swap hub that was temporarily set up on a barrow made by artists during that summer period. Next slide, please. So we had these experiences and we wanted to work out what could we do with them. So we were inspired by a book called Thinking Like a Mountain Towards the Council of All Beings. Next slide, please. By John Seed and Joanna Macy. And we wanted to talk about what happens when we stand in each other's shoes. Next slide, please. And we realized that the art world does this in our community work very well. And that if we can harness some of what we do very well with some of what the nature community does so very well, that actually we have something magical to work from. Next slide, please. And these are some of our community members making very basic things, putting your hand on the rock, making something, seeing it come to life. Next slide, please. And then sharing it with others. Next slide, please. This is a work by Mikhail Karakas, who was one of our project team, where he invited children in North Ormsbury Primary School to see the world through the eyes of a bee. Bees don't see the same colour spectrum as humans. We need to empathise. We need to step into each other's shoes. Next slide, please. So I am coming to the end of my time. There's lots more to say and there's lots more to talk about with you and within our own community as well. But what I wanted to ask you is, hands up, are you willing to work together? We know that very many businesses are appointing people called chief cultural officers, people who work alongside chief operational officers. In a business context, culture is often characterized by how we do things around here. And you may have heard the phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. How many great ideas have we seen die in the dust because they can't really affect change or encapsulate people's hearts and minds? The role of culture left out of the role of nature recovery, I believe, will mean the change you seek to enact in the world will not happen. Hands up, we are willing to work with you, and I hope this sector will come and work with us. Thank you very much.